So let's talk swords, shields, and veteran space marines. How good are Bladeguard in current Warhammer 40K? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and today I thought we'd do a focused unit review on the Bladeguard veterans, a fairly vicious primaris shield wall unit that can just stomp up the board, weather a load of fire, and still hand out the pain in combat. Let's talk over their model kits briefly, then on to their datasheet and damage output, a few obvious buffs and synergies, and how I'd think about running them in-game versus their competitors. Bladeguard veterans are basically veteran primaris space marines. Their models came out towards the start of 9th edition, and I think were quite a fun development to the primaris line. A lot of their miniatures are maybe just being a bit simplistic before now, and it was good to see some slightly more ornate and developed primaris models, these guys generally being really quite popular when they came out. The current kit from Games Workshop is currently £35, €45 or $60, not particularly amazing on the points per dollar front these days. When you get to less than 2 points per dollar, you are looking at fairly low for 40k in general. I think the models are nice, and the kit is kind of an interesting one. It's interesting that it's very flexible with posing and options that you could arm the veterans with, options for pistols and shields slung across their backs, lots of posing options, but weirdly compared with a lot of Space Marine kits, their actual war gear choices aren't really all that much. You basically have the option of a plasma pistol or neo-volkite pistol on one of them, otherwise it's just swords and shields in various poses. I would bear in mind that there's a fair few other good options for getting Bladeguard on the field. They were present in Indomitus, so often a fair few of them go for fairly cheap on eBay, at least compared with the multi-part kit. There's that Honoured of the Chapter box set from Games Workshop. If you wanted the other characters like the Judiciar, Bladeguard Ancient, and the Chaplain, then that could be okay. It's paired with all of those and some Eradicators, and also I have seen a fair few people convert them from Assault Intercessors, just adding on some shiny and blingy helmets. Plus Power Sword and Storm Shield bits aren't exactly the hardest to come by in 40k. If you were looking to pick some up though, then Element Games has some in the UK. They're 15% off at just under £30, so around a 15% discount there. If you're in the UK and you were looking to pick some up, if you bought any after clicking the link in the video description, some of the profits do go to help out the channel a bit, and it doesn't cost you any more when you buy. Getting onto their datasheet now, and Bladeguard veterans are an elite choice for Codex Space Marines, 35 points per model. You get them in squads of between 3 and 6, and they're fairly chunky primaris with strength and toughness 4, a big 3 wounds for some reason, 3 attacks, and their save is effectively a 2+ save with a 4+ invul due to all of them carrying storm shields. For the points cost, they really do have a pretty meaty defensive profile, one of the better units to be taking punishment out of the army if you get a choice, and they do have access to transhuman physiology as well, which can make that even better. Every model gets a heavy bolt pistol for a strength 4 AP-1 shot, frag and crack grenades, and their mastercrafted power swords, really quite nice generalist combat weapons with strength 5, AP3 and damage 2. They're particularly good at chewing through elite infantry, but might struggle a bit against -1 damage or high toughness things. They do put out a lot of attacks though. It's going to be 4 per model with shock assaults, or 5 on the sergeant. The volume of quality attacks that they get is pretty impressive, I think. Otherwise, they only really get one war gear choice as mentioned. They either get to take one guy with the neo-volkite pistol or the plasma pistol. Previously this costed 5 points, now it's free. Out of the two, the neo-volkite pistol I think is definitely the one to go for. 2 shots at 15 inches, strength 5, AP 0 and damage 2, but the chance for a mortal wound on an unmodified 6. As small arms go, it's really quite nice. Never really guaranteed to do anything, but just a small chance of doing something nasty against the toughest things around. A chance for mortal wounds and 2 damage is pretty brutal. I certainly wouldn't take the plasma pistol to be honest. You really don't want to be killing your own sergeant with an overheat. It really defeats the point of making them so tough and dangerous in combat. Otherwise, they do get a couple of keywords in certain chapters. Deathwing for the Dark Angels, which is very relevant with Inner Circle, and Wolfguard for the Space Wolves, which is very irrelevant, giving them nothing. Overall, as units go, I'd say their main advantages are good generalist damage, particularly against 2 wound infantry, good toughness with transhuman physiology to help them out if they need it, a core unit so you've got lots of options to support them, and on the downsides they're relatively slow. Anything that's toughness 6 or more or -1 damage blunts their damage output, and they do have competition from other units in the Space Marine Codex, maybe most notably the Terminator Assault Squad, as we'll get onto. In Arcs of Omen, Space Marines have had a pretty major shake-up. Loads of things lost Armour of Contempt, but gained big points cuts. Bladeguard largely weathered all that storm pretty much unchanged. Their Storm Shields didn't get Armour of Contempt anyway, and the only thing that they really got was the free pistol handout. They were coming from a place of being relatively strong beforehand though. I'd say perhaps the biggest thing that's changed for them in terms of being selected in the Space Marine army is a comparison to Storm Shield and Thunderhammer Terminators, as mentioned. Here's just a quick breakdown of their damage output against a few likely targets. Here's a squad of 3 for 105 points. You get 13 attacks at Strength 5, AP 3 and Damage 2, so really quite a high volume there. For that fairly cheap points cost, they do threaten the vast majority of things in the game. They kill around 6 Guardsmen, 5 Space Marines in power armor, about 2 Terminators, or roughly 5 wounds to a Toughness 7 vehicle. I'd say all of those are decently impressive. They only really fall down against things with invul saves and -1 damage, only 2 wounds to say something like a Plague Burst Crawler with Toughness 8, the invul, and the -1 damage mechanic. Overall though, fairly generalist, which is what they need to be as a frontline combat unit, and in particular they will just about kill their points cost in 2 wound infantry if you can get into them in a single round of combat. In terms of getting a bit more out of them, first up you could think about how you're going to deliver the Bladeguard to the fight. I'd say for the most part that despite their slow movement, they're not a terrible choice just to foot slog up the board. They don't really have much shooting, so you can usually just afford to advance them each turn that they're not making an assault, get them to somewhere scary. And if they are caught out in the open and take a round of firepower, it's perhaps less bad compared with other Space Marine units. Their Storm Shield and 2+ saves do give them an edge in durability. Perhaps in Arcs of Omen in particular, with Impulsors getting so much cheaper, I feel like you definitely could use a unit of Bladeguard and an Impulsor and that would also be fine. I'd argue that they are probably one of the very best units that you can put in an Impulsor, putting a whole load of scary melee primaris there on a fast moving transport, and then using it as a bit of a staging post to jump out and charge from, usually meaning that you get a full squad out into combat without any damage taken first. Definitely pretty reasonable, and you could even have a character along for the ride. Speaking of which, I would say that character support is really quite easy to use with Bladeguard, though maybe not so critical that it's absolutely mandatory. They do have strong enough stats to carry themselves without other buffs. First up, you can easily get damage rerolls from captains, lieutenants, chaplains, or chapter masters. All of those are absolutely fine. They do pair quite well with the Indomitus pattern that Captain and Lieutenant that came out at the start of 9th edition. Both of their Storm Shield loadouts are really quite efficient comparatively. They're also very easy to use with an Apothecary with their Feel No Pain type save, plus healing a model that got slain. And perhaps compared with just about any other Space Marine unit, I think they also work very nicely with a Judaseer as well. Not that you just get blown away in the shooting phase, and when they get charged the unit typically has a small footprint, meaning that you can probably keep the enemy units charging it within heroic intervention range of the Judaseer, so he can step up and use that Tempora Mortis to make the enemy fight last and the Bladeguard swing first. The Bladeguard Ancient, I guess, is relevant because he's got a unique buff for them. He makes them +1 to hit without upgrading to the Chapter Ancient that the rest of them do. Still though, I wouldn't really rate him as particularly strong to be honest. Maybe if he has some sort of relic special banner from your given chapter it could be okay, but I feel like he's just underwhelming as a character having no actual melee threat of his own. I think if you just want an extra damage buff, you may as well just use that Primaris Lieutenant with the Storm Shield. He'll give you a bit of extra damage and also fight very hard in combat himself, and also cost less than the Ancient does. Finally, on one of the characters supporting them, I think it's pretty reasonable to have Rites of War for objectives secured. Obsec is something that the Bladeguard will really like as a tough frontline unit. They're one of the units that can afford just to march up to the objectives and take it against all comers, so there's more chance that they're going to survive on an objective compared with most. Overall, character-wise, it depends what you're running in the rest of the army. You certainly don't want to be fielding all of them, but maybe 1 or 2 could be useful, depending on how many squads they're supporting. Finally, for useful generic stratagems from Codex Space Marines, 2 really stand out. Transhuman Physiology is perhaps the most useful one. That one means that they can only be wounded on a 4+, and when they're both a tough unit and only have toughness 4 to start with, it is really good. With 3 wounds and high saves, anti-tank weapons are often going to get fired at them. If you can make them only wound on a 4+, that's going to be a massive debuff to their damage output. It's also a good reason to keep the squad as a maximum of 5 models, so you don't have to pay 2 CP for it. Otherwise, for 1 command point, we've got Gene-Wrought Might as well. Again, this is probably more relevant on the Bladeguard compared with most other units. This is the one that gives you 6s to hit auto wound, and with only strength 5 against anything that's toughness 6 or more, they are going to be wounding on 5s with that. It's usually going to equate to an extra 50% damage output, and on such a dangerous squad as the Bladeguard, that could often be worth it, perhaps particularly if you've also got other things like character rerolls or chaplain rerolls on the go. In general, I think if you've got a squad of 5 or so that's punching up against a hard target and you don't think it's going to kill it anyway, then this is a very reasonable damage buff to use. Moving on to the various chapter synergies, as a big tough frontline assault unit, the Bladeguard have good synergies with just about all of them, though perhaps a bit less relevant with things that are more dedicated shooting chapters, perhaps things like Imperial Fists and Ultramarines. Still not saying that they're bad there, of course. They do have the stat line just to be fielded in any chapter if you really want to. Just about every chapter does have a pretty standout use case for them. Templars love their relatively slow moving melee units, really quite nice for their character buffs, and maybe giving a relic bearer to one of them, making one model obscenely tough, and then resurrecting it maybe with a nearby apothecary. They would also get on very well with impulsors, as they get the 5+ invul save for free on them, very nice to deliver them into combat. Space Wolves work pretty excellently for them as well. Their core strategy usually revolves around slightly slower units logging into melee. A +1 to hit and exploding sixes will certainly amp up their damage output, and they can even get a +1 to wound for stratagems as well. Salamanders, I think, are a really interesting chapter to fill Bladeguard with, this time not necessarily because of their chapter tactic or anything, but because of a few really nice stratagems that they have. Salamanders have one that allows them to countercharge an enemy unit, or tank fire for a unit behind them. It could be a good choice to absorb firepower for a unit of aggressors behind them perhaps, and ensure that the Flamestorm boys gets to fire a second time. A +1 to wound stratagem in combat again doesn't hurt on mid-strength weapons. Blood Angels are pretty excellent for delivering damage, again +1 to wound is great, and their assault doctrine for exploding sixes is nice. I think they're definitely very solid in Blood Angels, but just might not always fit in amazingly well with the overall strategy. A lot of Blood Angels units want to be jumping around the board on fast-moving jump packs, and it could mean that the Bladeguard get left behind. For the raw power boost though, they're certainly not bad. White Scars get on pretty nicely with Bladeguard too. Both their chapter tactic and their assault doctrine work out very nicely for them. Advance and charge really helps with their threat range, which can be a bit low otherwise, and damage 3 power swords from turn 3 is pretty scary. Certainly makes them a lot more vicious against things like multi-wound units and Terminators. I think for Raven Guard they can be a pretty interesting one for that redeployment Master of Ambush one, having them start up the board or just get into the midfield. Certainly makes them a lot more threatening early. And finally for Dark Angels, they do get the Deathwing keyword. It means that they can get permanent transhuman physiology, and the Bladeguard Ancient can be a lot more interesting, giving them +1 to hit and also -1 damage from the Pennant of Remembrance. Unfortunately though, they are competing against full-blooded Deathwing Terminators, which between Thunderhammers and 3 Cyclone missile launchers I think edge them out for the Dark Angels at the moment. Overall though, you can make a pretty decent argument for including them in the vast majority of chapters. Their stats are pretty solid, and they do have some pretty interesting synergies with the vast majority of chapters in the game. In terms of putting them on the board, here's how I'd be tempted to fill Bladeguards in current games of 40k though. First up, I'd keep the squads of sizes around 3 to 5 due to transhuman and blast rules. I'd probably aim for 5 rather than 3. It gives them a bit more critical mass in melee, and makes it a bit more viable to target stratagems and character buffs on them. I'd probably not invest too heavily into them, maybe just 1 or 2 units. I'd probably go for foot slogging over a transport, though I feel like using an impulsor isn't the worst idea now they're only 100 points. I'd take the Neo-Volkite pistol over the plasma pistol, and for character support I'd probably keep it fairly cheap. Depends on the chapter that you're playing and what other things that you want to buff, but something like a cheap lieutenant with Rights of War seems very reasonable to support them, get them objectives secured, and have another combat threat to back them up in melee. Apothecaries, chaplains, or Judiciars all seem pretty reasonable as well, to be honest though. Deployment wise, I want them fairly far forward, ideally hidden or in cover with that 2+ save, where it could mean that they're saving AP-2 things on a 3+ still. And out of units in the army, I would say that if anything needs to be exposed, the Bladeguard veterans maybe aren't the worst choice, again being fairly tanky for the cost. Perhaps not as critical that you hide them compared with things that are a lot more fragile for the points, say things like Eradicators or Attack Bikes perhaps. Then when battle is joined, move and advance them up to threatening positions, have them scrap over midfield objectives. If they can also remain out of line of sight or in light cover while doing so, then so much the better. Being a slightly slow-moving unit, they're probably not going to have the biggest choice as to what sort of things that they can charge, but if you do get the option, then hitting 2 wound Space Marines will be very nice indeed. And if they do find themselves punching up against something that they're wounding on 5s, definitely consider Gene-Wrought Might. It does actually add a fair amount of wounds to your target. When they're attacked back, I'd certainly consider things like transhuman physiology, particularly if the weapon is strength 8 or above. You're going to be saving a lot of Space Marines' lives that way. Overall, in the current game, I would say that Bladeguard are a solid unit for Codex Space Marines, though as mentioned, they do have their competitors. For more elite damage dealers, aggressors might not have the durability of Bladeguard without storm shields, but they certainly have a crazy amount of damage between close range anti-infantry and powerful power fists in combat. Vanguard veterans also have a bit more flexibility in terms of power weapons, plus move a lot faster. Again, they're pretty interesting and a strong competitor. For the Bladeguard's niche though, with slow-moving infantry with storm shields, it really is the Terminator Assault Squad that currently are the main competitors for them. They're only 33 points, and in general their defensive profile is a bit better. They start with a 2+ save before the storm shield, so effectively have a 1+ save, saving AP-1 on a 2+ still. They do lack transhuman unless they're Dark Angels ones, but I'd still say overall durability is a win for the Terminators, just due to the +1 save and being a bit cheaper. Damage wise, it's kind of interesting. Here's a damage breakdown weighted for 105 points, so the same as a small squad of Bladeguard. In terms of efficiency, the Bladeguard win pretty hard against Guardsmen or standard Space Marines with 2 wounds. They get more attacks and they don't hit on a 4+, unlike the Thunderhammers. It's pretty much even on heavy infantry like the Terminators, and then the Thunderhammers perhaps expectedly get ahead on hard targets, doing around about an extra 50% worth of damage to vehicles like Toughness 7 or Toughness 8 things. Overall, between the two, I would probably rate the Thunderhammer Terminators as the slightly more competitive unit in general at the moment, but I'd still say that it doesn't make the Bladeguard bad by any means. The numbers against hard targets get a lot closer if you can get something like a +1 to wound on them, and even then there are a lot of Space Marines in the meta at the moment. Being good at killing Toughness 4 and 5 things is no bad thing at all. Let me know your thoughts though. Are Bladeguard veterans making the cut for your army lists at the moment, or are they being left on the shelf in favour of other Space Marine nasties? Look forward to hearing your thoughts and how you think they stack up against the Terminator Assault Squad down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.